Hello, I'd just like to chat to you a little bit about pins, needles and thread for garment making, just so that you've got some guidelines. You can have a look at what you've got at home and decide whether you want to buy any additional supplies. Let's begin by looking at pins. Now, in my garment making, I do have different pins for different jobs. So if I was making something like a very fine silk blouse or a cotton lawn shirt or something like that, that wasn't a thick fabric, I would choose a fine pin because it's going to go in the layers of the fabric really easily. And what I would choose for that job is a 0.4 of a millimeter glass headed pin. These are made by Clover. There are other brands, but they are just perfect because they're very skinny pins. The glass head helps you to pick them up. I've got a really sharp point and they just glide into the fabric. So Clover, 0.4 of a millimeter glass headed pins, or another brand that makes similar. But I do find that they are not strong enough for thicker, more robust fabrics. So for example, if I was doing a heavy cotton, a denim, even wool, something like that, I would find that using those fine pins, they would bend as I put them into the fabric. So I choose a different pin, and the one that I particularly like is this particular brand. It's Iris Super Fine Pins, Swiss Iris. They come in this lovely tin. I'm just going to make a clicky noise as I open it. If you press on the top there, the lid pops off. Now this is a more conventional pin in that it doesn't have the glass head. It's a little bit thicker, but it's still nice and fine, and it goes through those little bit more robust fabrics more easily. It is a finer pin than a lot of general purpose dressmaking pins, and I've got some just general purpose dressmaking pins here, and when I pick up the two and compare them, the Swiss Iris one is finer. So I do want to have a choice and have those. You will see as we move through the classes that I do introduce other pins as well for different jobs, but those are the main ones that I use. I will just mention these. Another very nice, very fashionable pin at the moment are these Merchant and Mills entomology pins, and they are a nice long pin. They're a little bit longer than the other two, and they're quite robust. They're not as strong as the Swiss Iris, but they're stronger than the glass-headed ones. These actually come. The entomology part comes in when the Victorians used to get butterflies and moths for collections and pin them into display cases. So they're a nice long pin, kind of between the two in terms of strength. So you'll get to know what type of pins you personally enjoy using for the type of sewing that you like to do. So that's just my little starter on pins. Now let's have a look at hand sewing needles. Now I'm just going to chat about two hand sewing needles, and they are the ones I use most often. Again, I will be introducing different things, but these are the most commonly used ones. So for just general hand sewing on garments, hems, sewing on buttons, that kind of thing, I like to use an embroidery needle, which has a long thin eye, so it's easy to thread, but it is a nice slim needle, so it will go through your fabric really easily. I do find that as ladies get older and their eyesight's not so good, they tend to choose fatter needles because they have a bigger eye, but the fat needles don't glide through the fabric. So the advantage of the long thin eye means you can still have a nice fine needle, but you can see to actually thread it. And I choose both size 9 and 10. I like both of those for my hand sewing on all types of fabrics. I really don't change the size according to the fabric. So if it was a very fine lightweight fabric, I'd be using pretty much the same needle as I would use on a much heavier fabric. So those are my general purpose sewing needles. But I do also use straw or Milliners needles often for tacking. And the reason that I choose to use those for tacking is that they are a much longer needle. And when you're doing tacking and you're taking very big stitches, it's just more economical and easier to use a long needle. It's just more efficient. So these Milliners needles, again, in about size 9, are perfect for tacking and where you want a big stitch. So those are the two needles that I use most often. Sewing machine needles. The higher the number, the thicker the needle. So in a domestic situation, the finest needle that you will find for your sewing machine is a 60 on the whole, and the biggest you see, and you'll have to search for it, is probably 120, which you might use for sewing really heavy canvas. So what am I going to choose within that range? Well, I tend obviously to choose a finer needle for finer fabrics and a thicker needle, a bigger needle, for more heavy duty fabrics. But I do tend to use a 70 or an 80 for most kind of garments, in terms of things like cotton dresses, blouses, things like that. I would use possibly an 80 for a woolen fabric. It's quite rare for me to use thicker needles than that. And again, all of this will be explained as we move through the classes, but you might want to get a little range of needles together. Now, I've explained how the sizing system works, but there are many, many different types of needles that you can buy, and the most common one is a universal needle. That is exactly what it says. It sews most types of fabrics. I personally tend not to use universal needles, and I tend to use microtex needles. The difference between a microtex and a universal is that a microtex has a finer blade. It's just a little bit skinnier. The blade is the long bit of the needle that has the groove in it that the thread runs down. And a microtex needle also has a sharper point, so it will penetrate the fabric more easily than the universal needle. And what you're looking for is a needle that will go between the fibres of the weave without damaging a thread as it goes through. And you've probably all seen that on cheap jeans. You've probably even done it yourself. Every time you take a stitch, your needle just pierces a thread in the fabric. So for a cotton dress, a cotton blouse, something like that, I'm going to try a 70 or /10. It's the same thing. It's like imperial metric. A 70-10 microtex. If I was using a fine woolen fabric, I might go to an 80. I might try a 90 in a heavy duty wool, but I will test that as I actually start sewing. So the two most common microtex needles that I use are the 70/10 and the 80/12, and you'll see me use those repeatedly. So you might like to try those out and get yourself a packet of each. I will change needles often, and I do, if possible, buy them in little boxes of 100 needles, because you're more likely to change them because they're not quite so precious, because they're a little bit cheaper in terms of the individual cost of the needles. You will see that the needles that I've got in front of me here are Schmetz needles, and Schmetz have a fabulous website with tons of information on it. It's well worth just googling Schmetz and going to their website. So those are the needles that I'm going to use most commonly, but I do have a big range of other needles for different applications. Now, I don't want you to be rushing out and buying lots of kind of these more specialist needles at this point, but they will come into their own in various projects throughout the series. So there is a leather needle here that has a very sharp point that cuts into leather. I've got a jeans needle here which also has a very sharp point, so it will penetrate those firm fabrics very easily. This silk needle here is actually made by Organ, and it's a 55 needle, so it's really fine for very fine fabrics, and it works beautifully with fine silks and cotton lawns, that kind of thing. I've got an embroidery needle here which has a bigger eye in it and a different groove, which is really useful if you're using some kind of decorative thread on a project where you find that your thread might be shredding and breaking as you sew. I've got a metallic needle which is also the same thing, for use with metallic threads and helps to stop those shreddings. And then on the end, and this is not an exhaustive range, there are other things as well, but I've got a ballpoint needle which is exactly what it says, in that instead of having a very sharp point to the tip, it's slightly rounded so that it doesn't pierce and break a chain in the knitted fabric that you are sewing. And again, all of these needles come in a whole range of sizes, from very fine to very heavy duty. So just again, have a look at various websites, go online, research it and learn a little bit more about needles, and I will be teaching you a lot more about needles as we go through our garment making question time series.